I thought it was going to be just another long, exhausting shift. I was so wrong. My mornings had always followed the same pattern, almost like a worn-out tape that played the same music on repeat every single day, and there was a certain comfort in the predictability of it. I would wake up in my small, dimly lit apartment, the sound of traffic outside mixing with the distant hum of the city, and I would sit on the edge of my bed for a moment, staring at the cracks in the wall, reminding myself that another 12 hours of standing guard awaited me. Being a security guard was not glamorous, and certainly not well-paying, but it was honest work, and in my world, honesty was one of the few things I still had left to hold on to. I often told myself that my life was like that old gate I stood by every day, strong enough to serve a purpose, yet ignored by everyone who passed through. People came and went, important people in expensive suits, talking into their phones, carrying themselves with the kind of confidence that only comes from money and power. They rarely looked at me. If they did, it was usually just a passing glance, the kind of acknowledgement you give to a wall clock when checking the time. I was there, yet invisible. I mattered only if something went wrong. It was as if my very existence only carried weight when it came to preventing trouble, and on most days, trouble never came. The pay was barely enough to keep me afloat, yet I held on to the job because it was the only thread keeping my family and me from falling into an even darker place. My mother's medication, the rent, and the endless bills that piled up on the table each month all depended on this one uniform I wore with pride, even if it wasn't seen by anyone else as something to respect. I used to iron it carefully every morning, making sure each crease was straight, each button fastened tightly, because I believed that discipline, even in the smallest of things, was a reflection of who I was as a man. If life had stripped me of luxuries, at least it could not strip me of my dignity. That morning, as I walked toward the company building where I had been stationed for over a year, everything looked the same. The gray pavement glistened faintly from last night's rain, the street vendors were setting up their carts, and the early office workers were arriving one by one. I nodded at a few of them, though most pretended not to notice me. The security booth felt colder than usual, or maybe it was just me, but I brushed the thought aside, clocked in, and prepared myself for the long hours ahead. My routine was simple. Stand guard, check IDs, open the gate, close the gate, repeat. It was the kind of rhythm that numbed the mind, but I had grown used to it, almost comforted by the monotony, because monotony meant safety. Nothing unpredictable, nothing dangerous, nothing that could cost me the job I depended on so heavily. Still, beneath that routine, there was always a quiet ache inside me. Sometimes, while standing by the gate, I would watch the executives stride past me, and I couldn't help but imagine what it must feel like to live their lives. To not count every penny before paying rent, to not wonder if the electricity bill would have to wait until next month, to not wake up every morning with the heavy weight of survival pressing down on the chest. I never envied their wealth as much as I envied their freedom, the freedom to live without fear of falling apart tomorrow. Yet, even in those quiet moments of longing, I reminded myself to stand straight, to remain alert, to keep my mind on the job. Daydreaming never fed anyone, and I could not afford to lose focus. The hours crawled forward, the kind of hours where the ticking of the clock sounded louder than the chatter of the people passing by. I checked IDs, greeted employees, and waved through deliveries, every action as mechanical as the last. Nothing seemed unusual, nothing hinted at what was about to unfold. Nothing suggested that this particular day would separate itself from the hundreds before it. If anything, I remember thinking how unbearably normal everything was, the kind of morning that would disappear into memory without leaving a trace. But then, life has a strange way of breaking its own patterns when you least expect it. Just when you begin to believe that tomorrow will look exactly like today, fate slips in something extraordinary, something you cannot prepare for, something that reminds you that even in the dullest routines, change waits just around the corner. That change arrived for me in the form of a man I had never seen before, walking toward the gate with a kind of confidence that immediately unsettled me. He wasn't like the others. Most employees hurried in with badges in hand, muttering into their phones, barely paying attention to the world around them. But this man walked slowly, deliberately, as though every step he took belonged to him and him alone. He wasn't wearing the company badge around his neck, and yet his tailored suit, polished shoes, and piercing eyes spoke of someone who wasn't used to being stopped. The way he carried himself, chin slightly raised, gaze steady, gave the impression that rules were for other people, not for him. Something inside me tightened instantly, a voice whispering that I should be cautious, though I could not yet explain why. I straightened up, adjusted my uniform, and prepared myself to speak. This was just protocol, I reminded myself, the same protocol I had followed with countless others. And yet, as he drew closer, my hands felt heavier, my throat dry, as if something invisible was already shifting in the air. I never imagined that stopping this one man would change everything. But then, a man walked toward the gate, and something about him made me stop breathing. From the second I saw him, I knew he wasn't like anyone I had stopped before. There was a presence about him, the kind that demanded attention without a single word spoken. He didn't rush like the other employees, didn't glance at his watch nervously, didn't shuffle through his bag to find his ID card. Instead, he walked as if the entire building belonged to him, and everyone else was simply borrowing space. His suit was the kind that looked custom-made, perfectly fitted at the shoulders, pressed to the point where not a single wrinkle dared to appear. His shoes gleamed under the faint morning light, polished so sharply that I could almost see my own reflection in them. But what truly caught me off guard wasn't the expensive clothing, nor the slow and deliberate walk. It was the eyes. Sharp, unblinking, and fixed straight ahead, they gave the impression of a man who had never in his life been told no. It wasn't arrogance in the ordinary sense, but something deeper, as though the world itself had bent its rules around him for so long that he no longer recognized boundaries. My heart picked up a nervous rhythm as he drew closer to the gate. I forced myself to stay calm, to remind myself of my duty. Rules were rules, and no matter how confident someone looked, entry without an ID was strictly forbidden. Still, a small voice in my mind whispered that I should let him pass, that confronting a man like this could only lead to trouble. But that voice clashed with another, louder one, the voice that had kept me alive in this job. Follow the protocol, no exceptions. So, as he approached, I stepped forward, keeping my tone firm but polite. "Excuse me, sir, may I see your ID?" The man didn't break his stride. He didn't even turn his head toward me, as though I were nothing more than a gust of wind brushing past him. His shoes clicked against the pavement, steady and unhurried. It was only when I moved directly into his path, placing myself between him and the gate, that he finally stopped. He looked at me then, slowly, like someone forced to acknowledge an insect on his arm. His eyes swept over me from head to toe, taking in the cheap uniform, the scuffed boots, the weariness that I tried so hard to hide. There was no respect in his gaze, no acknowledgement of me as a man simply doing his job. Instead, there was irritation, the kind of irritation wealthy men often reserve for things they consider beneath them, like long lines, traffic jams, or security guards asking questions. "I don't have time for this," he said flatly, his voice low but carrying an authority that made the air feel heavier. I swallowed hard, trying not to let the tremor in my chest show on my face. "I'm sorry, sir, but company policy requires every visitor to show identification before entering. If you don't have your ID, I'll need to register you first." For a moment, silence hung between us. He studied me as though deciding whether I was worth the trouble of speaking to again. The employees passing by had slowed their steps, some glancing at us curiously, others smirking as if they already knew what would happen. I could hear faint murmurs, someone whispering that I must be crazy to stop a man like that. But I kept my shoulders straight, forcing myself to hold the line. The man finally let out a faint laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Do you know who I am?" he asked, each word laced with disbelief. The question stung, because the truth was I didn't. I had no idea. Yet something inside me told me that it didn't matter who he was. The rules were the same for everyone. My voice shook only slightly as I replied, "I'm just following protocol, sir. Without proper identification, I can't allow you inside." His expression hardened. The faint smirk vanished, replaced by a look that could cut through steel. He leaned in slightly, just enough that I could see the fine lines around his eyes, the weight of years of authority etched into his face. His voice dropped lower, quieter, but somehow more dangerous than before. "You're making a mistake." The words sliced through me, my stomach knotted, my palms dampened inside my gloves, and for a split second, doubt crept in. Was I making a mistake? Had I just challenged someone far above my reach? The whispers around us grew louder. A few employees chuckled under their breath. One muttered something about me losing my job by noon. The humiliation pressed against me, hot and suffocating. But I forced myself to stand firm. Inside, my thoughts were racing. Who was this man? Why did he act as though the rules didn't apply to him? And most importantly, what would happen to me if I pushed too far? Every instinct screamed at me to step aside, to let him pass, to avoid the storm I could see building in his expression. But another instinct, the one built from years of discipline and survival, reminded me of something my father used to say. A man who bends his integrity once will never stand straight again. So I didn't move. I held my ground, my voice steady, though my chest thudded painfully. "With all due respect, sir, no one is allowed inside without clearance. I'll need to ask you to wait until we can confirm your access." For a long moment, he didn't speak. He simply stared into my eyes, unblinking, unyielding, as though measuring the weight of my courage against his authority. The silence was louder than the voices around us, louder than the traffic in the distance, louder than the pounding of my own heart. And then, slowly, he leaned even closer, so close that I could feel the cold edge in his words before he spoke them. And when he looked me in the eye, I realized I had just made a dangerous mistake. Every word we exchanged felt like a battle between two different worlds. On one side stood a man whose confidence was carved out of wealth, authority, and years of commanding others, while on the other side stood me, a poorly paid guard whose only power came from a rule book and the fragile strength of discipline. The tension between us was sharp enough to be felt in the air, and for a moment it was as if time itself slowed down to watch which of us would bend first. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit with deliberate precision, as though even the smallest gesture was designed to remind me of the difference between us. "I don't have time for this nonsense," he said firmly, his voice smooth but laced with authority. Then, without waiting for my response, he stepped forward, attempting to brush past me as though I were nothing more than an obstacle on the sidewalk. Instinctively, I raised my hand and blocked his path. My chest tightened, not from anger, but from the suffocating fear that every action I took could have consequences far greater than I was prepared for. Still, I couldn't move aside. The company's rules were clear: no ID, no entry. I had lived my entire life holding on to the belief that rules existed to protect order, and in that moment, to break them felt like betraying myself. "Sir, I'll need you to stop," I said, my voice steady but carrying the weight of all the eyes now watching. Around us, the scene was changing. Employees who usually walked past without a word were slowing down, pausing just out of earshot, their curiosity overpowering their need to rush inside. A few whispered to each other, pointing discreetly in our direction. Some smirked, enjoying the rare spectacle of a guard daring to challenge someone who clearly didn't look like he belonged in the waiting line of ordinary visitors. Their murmurs wrapped around me like chains, each one tugging at my confidence, each one making me wonder if I had just walked myself into the middle of a storm that could swallow me whole. The man's eyes narrowed, his tone dropping lower, sharper. "I told you I don't have time. Step aside." His words weren't shouted, but they cut deeper than any raised voice could have, carrying the weight of someone used to obedience. I drew in a deep breath, summoning strength from the only place I could: my principles. "With all due respect, sir, I can't let you through without proper identification. If you'll give me your name, I can call upstairs and confirm your clearance." It was the most professional response I could muster, but instead of diffusing the tension, it ignited it. His jaw tightened, and for a fleeting moment I saw something flicker in his expression. Was it disbelief? Amusement? Rage? Perhaps it was all three, twisting together into a storm that threatened to crash down on me. The whispers around us grew louder, and now I could hear distinct words. "Doesn't he know who that is?" someone muttered. "That guard must be out of his mind," another added, followed by a stifled laugh. My ears burned, and shame fought against the fragile wall of my resolve. It would have been so easy to step aside, to let the man pass, to end the scene before it became a spectacle. But then I thought of my family, of the bills waiting for me at home, of the one piece of dignity I had left. If I lost my job because I failed to follow protocol, what would I have left? I shifted slightly, planting my feet more firmly on the ground, as if rooting myself to the spot. My uniform may have been cheap, my salary may have been pitiful, but in that moment the uniform was a shield, and the rules were my sword. The man let out a slow exhale, his eyes never leaving mine. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" he said, his tone almost mocking now. "I don't, sir," I admitted truthfully, my throat dry. "But my job isn't about who a person is. It's about what the rules say." For the first time, a faint, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Not a smile of kindness, but of disbelief. He shook his head slightly, as though baffled by my stubbornness. Then he stepped forward again, this time brushing his shoulder against mine, trying to force his way past. My pulse thundered in my ears, panic threatening to seize control, but my body moved before my fear could stop it. I extended my arm across the gate, firmly blocking his entry. Gasps rippled through the small crowd that had gathered, the sound of collective shock that a man like me would dare to touch, even in the slightest way. A man like him. My heart hammered so violently that I wondered if it might give out on the spot. Yet I refused to let my arm falter. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be," I said softly, almost pleading now, but still refusing to move. The air between us thickened, and for a moment I felt as though we weren't two men at a gate anymore. We were symbols. He represented wealth, power, and privilege, the kind that moved without question. I represented rules, boundaries, and the fragile threads of integrity that ordinary men like me clung to because we had nothing else. The clash wasn't just between us. It was between worlds, and the outcome felt like it would determine more than just who walked through the gate. The man leaned closer, so close that I could smell the faint trace of his cologne, something expensive and refined, a scent I had only ever encountered in passing whiffs from the executives who brushed past me daily. His voice dropped into a whisper, each word deliberate, calculated, and heavy enough to send a chill down my spine. Then he leaned closer and whispered something that made my heart stop. The laughter around me cut deeper than any insult I had ever heard. It wasn't loud, not the kind of laughter that fills a room, but it was sharp, quiet, and cruel, the kind that sneaks under your skin and makes you feel small, foolish, and exposed. At first it was just a few muffled chuckles, but soon it spread, rippling through the small crowd that had gathered, until I could hear snickers behind hands, whispers exchanged with mocking smiles, and even outright giggles that people weren't bothering to hide anymore. It was as if my insistence on the rules had turned me into the punchline of some cruel joke. My face burned hot, and for a moment I wanted nothing more than for the ground beneath me to open up and swallow me whole. I had been laughed at before, but this felt different. This wasn't just about me as a man. This was about me as a guard, about my uniform, my job, my dignity, all of it being chipped away with every snicker that echoed in the air. It was the kind of laughter that didn't just mock what you did, but who you were. I could hear someone whisper, "Doesn't he realize who he's talking to?" Followed by a hushed laugh that carried a sting sharper than a slap. Another voice chimed in, "He's finished after this, no doubt about it." Each word wrapped itself around my chest like a tightening rope, suffocating me with the cruel possibility that maybe, just maybe, they were right. For the first time since I had stepped in front of the man, doubt crept in with a force I couldn't fight. What if I was wrong? What if I had just disrespected someone untouchable, someone with the power to end my career with a single phone call? What if this wasn't just another employee or an arrogant visitor, but someone whose name carried weight far beyond these walls? My hands trembled slightly, though I hid them behind my back, trying desperately to maintain the illusion of strength. The man's eyes never left mine, cold and unreadable, but the silence between us was now filled with the chorus of ridicule coming from the onlookers. It was unbearable. I wanted to shout at them, to tell them that I was just doing my job, that I was only following the rules, that I wasn't trying to be a hero or pick a fight. But the words lodged themselves in my throat, weighed down by shame. And then fear began to sink its claws into me. The kind of fear that went beyond embarrassment, reaching into the very core of survival. This job wasn't just a paycheck. It was my lifeline. Without it, I wouldn't be able to keep a roof over my mother's head, or pay for the medicine she needed every week, or even afford to keep food on the table. Every cent mattered, every hour of work mattered, and the thought of losing it all because of a single misstep was unbearable. What if I had miscalculated? What if my stubbornness, my refusal to move aside was about to cost me everything? Images flashed in my mind, standing outside the landlord's office, begging for another week to pay the rent, watching my mother's face when I told her I had lost my job, feeling the weight of helplessness crushing me as I searched for work in a city where men like me were invisible. My throat tightened, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I considered stepping aside, swallowing my pride, and pretending none of this had ever happened. But then another thought pushed its way in, quieter but steadier. A voice that reminded me why I had taken this stand in the first place. It wasn't pride. It wasn't ego. It was duty. The rules were clear, and if I let them bend for one man, then what did that say about me? What did that say about the uniform I wore every day, about the dignity I tried so hard to hold on to even when the world refused to see me? Still, the weight of isolation was crushing. In that moment, surrounded by laughter and ridicule, I felt utterly alone. No one stood by me, no one defended me, no one saw me as anything more than a fool picking a fight with someone far beyond his reach. Loneliness has a way of making a man doubt himself more than any enemy ever could. And as I stood there, my mind swayed dangerously between conviction and collapse. The man finally broke the silence. His lips curved into the faintest smirk, the kind of smile that told me he held all the power, and he knew it. He looked past me, toward the crowd, as if silently inviting them to enjoy the spectacle even more, then brought his gaze back to me. "You're standing on very thin ice," he said calmly, his voice carrying enough weight to silence even some of the laughter around us. My heart thudded painfully. I wanted to ask him who he was, to beg for clarity, to somehow diffuse the storm gathering in his words. but I stayed quiet, too afraid that speaking would only make things worse. The crowd whispered again, softer this time, but every murmur still reached me like an accusation. He's gone after today. Doesn't he get it? That man could fire him with a snap of his fingers. Their voices bled into my thoughts until they became indistinguishable from my own doubts. I stood there, my body frozen between fear and responsibility, humiliation and pride, loneliness and duty. It felt like an eternity of being torn apart from the inside out, of trying to stand tall while the world around me watched eagerly for me to fall. And then, just as the weight of it all threatened to break me completely, the man straightened his posture, adjusted his tie with slow precision, and spoke words that silenced the entire crowd. But then, he revealed a truth that flipped everything upside down. People saw just a uniform, but behind it was a man fighting battles no one cared about. To them, I was only the figure at the gate, the man who nodded as they passed, who checked their badges, who opened doors they never even realized were locked. I was invisible, in plain sight, a background character in the busy theater of their lives. What none of them saw was the life that waited for me outside these walls, a life built on sacrifices and silent struggles, where every coin counted and every decision carried the weight of survival. I was born into a world that gave me very little to begin with. My childhood was not filled with toys or vacations, but with long nights of hunger and mornings where I learned to pretend that an empty stomach was normal. My father had worked in a factory most of his life, until an accident left him unable to lift heavy loads. And from that day forward, the responsibility of the household shifted like a storm onto my shoulders. I was just a teenager then, but the weight of being the eldest son meant that my dreams, whatever they had been, were no longer mine to follow. School became a luxury, one I couldn't afford. Instead, I stepped into the world of labor, taking odd jobs, working nights, anything that would keep food on the table and the lights from going out. It wasn't a heroic story, not the kind that movies are made from. It was a slow, grinding existence, where dignity was carved not from success, but from endurance. I learned to eat less so that my younger siblings could have more. I wore shoes with holes at the bottom, stuffing paper inside to keep the rain out, while pretending to friends that it didn't bother me. When I finally managed to secure a steady job as a security guard, it wasn't out of ambition, but necessity. It was the kind of job no one bragged about, the kind that others pitied. But to me, it was a lifeline, a fragile rope pulling me and my family out of the abyss we were dangerously close to falling into. Every month, the paycheck I received looked small to others, but to me, it was the difference between survival and despair. It paid for my mother's medicine, the one thing that kept her fragile body steady after years of illness. It covered just enough of the rent so that we wouldn't face the humiliation of eviction. It kept the refrigerator stocked, even if most days it was filled with only the bare minimum: rice, beans, bread, and the occasional meat when times were slightly better. There were no luxuries, no savings, no cushion to fall back on. Every cent had a destination before it even touched my hands. And yet, despite the hardships, I carried my uniform with pride. I pressed it every morning, making sure it was neat, because even if the world didn't respect me, I wanted to respect myself. My father once told me that dignity was not about what you wore, but how you wore it. And I clung to that lesson fiercely. So while others saw only a man standing by a gate, I knew that behind the uniform was someone holding together the fragile strands of an entire family's survival. Still, the loneliness of that fight was overwhelming. People around me lived their lives without ever noticing men like me. They assumed their safety, their comfort, their routines, without realizing that someone else's watchful eyes and weary legs made it possible. They saw the uniform, but they never wondered about the man inside it. And perhaps that was the cruelest part, knowing that your battles were invisible, that your sacrifices existed in silence, that the world moved on without ever realizing the weight you carried. I remember nights when I would come home after a 12-hour shift, my body aching from standing, my mind drained from constant alertness. I would sit quietly in the dark, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, and wonder how much longer I could keep this up. But then I would think of my mother's fragile smile, the relief in her eyes when she took her medicine, and I would remind myself that giving up was not an option. I would think of my siblings, their laughter during rare moments of joy, and I would hold on to the belief that my sacrifices meant something, even if no one else saw them. This job mattered because it was more than just work. It was proof that I could still stand tall, that I hadn't been crushed completely by the weight of life. It gave me structure, discipline, a sense of purpose, even if that purpose was as small as guarding a gate that most people didn't notice. And perhaps that was why I clung so fiercely to the rules. Rules were all I had left to hold on to in a world that seemed designed to break me. If I bent them, if I compromised, then what was left of me? So when I stood there in front of that man, facing the weight of his arrogance, it wasn't just about the rule book in my hand. It was about everything I had endured, everything I had fought for, everything I was still fighting for. My refusal to step aside was born from years of struggle, from a life where giving in meant losing far more than pride. It meant losing the very thread that held me and my family together. But as I listened to the laughter of the crowd, as I felt the heat of humiliation burn across my face, the fragile wall of my resolve began to crack. Doubt seeped through, whispering in my ear, reminding me of how quickly everything I had built could vanish. One wrong move, one wrong decision, and the paycheck that kept my family alive would disappear. My sacrifices would amount to nothing, my battles forgotten, my dignity crushed under the heel of a single man's authority. The memories of my past struggles collided violently with the terrifying possibility of my future. I had endured so much, fought so hard. But what if it all ended here? What if my years of sacrifice were about to be undone in a single morning, in front of a crowd that would never even remember my name? And now, all of it, the years of struggle, was about to collapse in front of my eyes. The man I had just challenged wasn't just important. He was the most powerful man in the building. The moment his identity slipped into the air, it was as though the ground shifted beneath my feet. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd, moving from one person to the next until it became an audible wave of gasps, disbelief, and nervous murmurs. The people who had moments ago been laughing at my stubbornness now stood frozen, their eyes darting between him and me as if they were waiting for a storm to erupt. It was then that someone in the back, a woman clutching her ID badge nervously, whispered the words I will never forget. "That's the CEO." My entire body went cold. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me pale, trembling, and hollow. The letters, CEO, echoed in my mind with brutal clarity, each one striking like a hammer against the fragile wall of my confidence. The man I had stopped, the man I had argued with, the man I had stood in front of so defiantly, was not just another executive, not just another arrogant visitor. He was the very head of the company, the man whose decisions rippled down through every department, every paycheck, every corner of the building I guarded. He wasn't someone who answered to rules. He was the man who wrote them. The weight of the realization nearly crushed me. My knees felt weak, my breath uneven, and for a moment I thought I might collapse right there in front of everyone. The crowd seemed to close in, their eyes burning holes through me, their whispers cutting deeper than any blade. "He's finished. No way he keeps his job now. Did you see the look on the CEO's face?" Their words wrapped around me, suffocating me, dragging me deeper into the pit of fear I had been trying so hard to fight. My mind spiraled into panic. I imagined being called into the office, told to hand over my badge, escorted out like a criminal. I imagined the look of disappointment on my mother's face when I returned home with no job, no paycheck, no way to provide. I imagined the laughter of my colleagues who had doubted me, the pity of those who saw me as just another man crushed under the weight of a world that showed no mercy to people like me. And yet, in the midst of that fear, I couldn't move. I stood rooted to the spot, staring at him, my chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. He was calm, too calm, as though none of this surprised him, as though he had seen this play out many times before. His gaze was steady, sharp, unreadable. It wasn't the rage I had expected, nor was it the disdain I had already tasted in his earlier words. It was something far more dangerous, something that kept me suspended between terror and confusion. The silence between us was unbearable. Every second stretched into an eternity, each tick of the clock hammering into me like a countdown to my own destruction. The crowd didn't dare move. They were spectators to a scene they knew would end in disaster, and I was the fool standing at the center of it. My hands itched with the urge to do something, salute him, apologize, step aside, beg for mercy, but my body betrayed me, refusing to act. All I could do was stand there, trembling under the weight of his gaze, waiting for the inevitable words that would end my career. Finally, he spoke. His voice was calm, measured, the kind of voice that could silence a room without needing to be raised. "So," he said slowly, "you thought it was a good idea to stop me?" The words sliced into me. There was no good answer, no way to explain myself without sounding either arrogant or pathetic. I swallowed hard, my throat painfully dry, and forced out the only truth I had. I was only following protocol, sir." His expression didn't change. He studied me for what felt like an eternity, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though he was searching for something beneath the surface of my trembling exterior. The crowd leaned in closer, hungry for the explosion they believed was about to come. But the explosion never came. Instead, something far stranger happened. He straightened his posture, adjusted his tie with deliberate care, and then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, his lips curved upward into a smile. Not a wide grin, not a forced smirk, but a calm, measured smile that held no warmth, no reassurance. It was the kind of smile that sent a chill down my spine, the kind of smile that told me this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps echoed once more, people exchanging confused glances, unsure of what they were witnessing. Some even stepped back, as though sensing that something unpredictable was about to unfold. And I felt my fear twist into something sharper, darker, because that smile wasn't comforting, it wasn't forgiving, it was terrifying. But instead of anger, he smiled, and that smile terrified me even more. The silence was heavier than any punishment I had ever faced. It stretched between us like a vast canyon, filling the space with an invisible weight that pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Around us, the crowd that had gathered was absolutely still, as if the entire building itself was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when the CEO's judgment would come crashing down on me. My heart pounded so loudly I feared everyone could hear it, and the sweat gathering at the back of my neck trickled slowly beneath my collar. He didn't speak. He didn't shout. He didn't even frown. Instead, he studied me, his sharp eyes locked on mine, scanning every inch of my face as though he was reading words written across my skin. Those eyes were unreadable, cold but not cruel, piercing but not reckless, detached yet frighteningly focused. The silence was a weapon, and he wielded it masterfully. With every second that passed, the tension grew unbearable, each moment dragging longer than the last, until time itself seemed to stretch and warp around us. I tried to hold his gaze, but it was like staring into a storm. My mind screamed at me to look away, to find some corner of safety, but something inside me wouldn't let me flinch. If this was the end of my career, if this was the moment that would shatter everything I had worked to protect, then I would at least face it head-on, without shrinking. Still, fear dug its claws deeper with each passing second. My imagination raced ahead, painting the cruel possibilities of what might come next. I could already see myself being escorted off the premises, my badge stripped from me, my name blacklisted from any future opportunities in security. I imagined the crushing weight of returning home to my mother, explaining how my stubbornness had cost us the only stability we had. I imagined the disappointment in her tired eyes, the helplessness in my siblings' faces, the cruel satisfaction of those who had mocked me when I dared to stand firm. Every scenario felt like a blade hovering above my head, ready to drop at any moment. The silence made it worse. If he had shouted, if he had lashed out in anger, I could have endured it. I could have taken the words, the humiliation, even the dismissal, because at least then the punishment would have been clear. But this quiet, this unbearable pause, was 1,000 times worse. It was the anticipation of destruction, the waiting for a blow you knew was coming but could not prepare for. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, my tongue heavy. For a fleeting moment, I considered speaking, to explain myself, to apologize, to beg, but the words died in my chest. What could I possibly say that wouldn't sound pitiful or desperate? What defense could I offer that would matter to a man who held the power to end my livelihood with a single sentence? So I stood in silence, mirroring his, waiting for the inevitable. Around us, the employees were whispering again, their voices soft but slicing through me all the same. He's done for sure. Why isn't the CEO saying anything? Maybe he's deciding how badly to punish him. Their words only fueled the storm inside me. Each murmur was a reminder that I was utterly alone, that no one here would stand up for me, that all eyes were fixed on me as though I were a condemned man waiting for the hammer to fall. And yet, a small part of me still clung to the tiniest spark of dignity. I straightened my back, forced my shoulders not to slump, and tried to keep my voice steady inside my own mind. I told myself that even if this was the end, even if I walked away in disgrace, I had at least done what I believed was right. It was a fragile comfort, but it was all I had left. The CEO tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. He studied me like a puzzle he hadn't yet decided whether to solve or discard. His silence was no longer just unnerving. It was suffocating. My lungs screamed for air, but my chest felt locked in a vice. Seconds stretched into minutes, and minutes felt like hours, the unbearable weight of waiting gnawing at my very soul. I could see it in the faces of the onlookers. They were waiting for the explosion. Some were almost eager, their eyes lit with the cruel anticipation of watching me crumble under the wrath of power. Others looked nervous, as though afraid they too might be caught in the aftermath. But none of them moved. None of them intervened. They all just watched, like spectators at a theater, waiting for the climax of a play they couldn't look away from. And then, as my fear reached its breaking point, as the silence threatened to shatter me from the inside out, he finally moved. His lips parted, his eyes still locked on mine, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension like a blade. Then finally, he opened his mouth, and his words shook me to the core. What I thought would destroy me turned out to be the very thing that saved me. When the CEO finally spoke, his voice wasn't the thunderous explosion of anger I had been bracing myself for. It wasn't a roar of authority, nor a command to strip me of my badge and escort me out. Instead, it was calm, steady, and yet filled with a weight that seemed to settle over everyone present. His words didn't tear me apart. They unraveled me, but in a way I could never have anticipated. "You did your job," he said simply, his eyes never leaving mine. "And you did it well. For a moment, I couldn't comprehend what I had just heard. My mind, so prepared for punishment, for dismissal, for humiliation, refused to process the possibility that his words weren't filled with condemnation. The crowd fell silent, their whispers cut off mid-breath, as though the very air had been sucked out of the courtyard. The silence that followed wasn't heavy like before. It was stunned, disbelieving, electrified. I blinked at him, confusion warring with fear. "Sir?" My voice cracked slightly, betraying the storm inside me. The CEO straightened, adjusting his tie as if resetting the stage. His gaze swept over the crowd for a brief moment before returning to me. "Do you know how many people would have let me pass without question?" he asked, his tone steady. "Do you know how many times I've walked into this building without being stopped, without anyone daring to enforce the rules?" His words hit me like a revelation. My chest tightened, not from fear this time, but from the dawning realization that this entire confrontation had been something more than arrogance, more than defiance. He stepped closer, his shoes clicking softly against the pavement, his voice carrying clearly to every ear in the crowd. "I've been testing my employees," he continued, "testing whether they would bend the rules for someone who looked important, someone who acted like the rules didn't apply, and time after time they failed. They let me through. They chose comfort over duty. But you—" He paused, letting the silence hang before pointing slightly toward me. "You didn't." My heart pounded, my knees almost buckling, not from fear this time, but from shock. The truth was staggering. All this time I had believed I was standing on the edge of ruin, about to lose everything I had fought for, yet, in reality, I had been standing on the very foundation of what might become the most defining moment of my life. The crowd erupted in gasps, the shift in their perception almost audible. The same people who had mocked me minutes earlier now looked at me with wide eyes, their expressions transformed from amusement to astonishment. Some glanced at each other as though silently questioning how they had misjudged the situation so badly. I could see respect dawning in the faces of a few, hesitation in others, and shame in many. The CEO's voice cut through the shock, steady and sharp. "Integrity is rare. Honesty is rare. The ability to stand firm even when it costs you everything, rarer still." He let the words hang, his gaze drilling into me, making me feel both exposed and honored at the same time. "You didn't see me as above the rules. You saw me as another man who needed to follow them, and that, my friend, is exactly the kind of courage I value." My throat tightened, my eyes stung, and for the first time in years, I felt the strange rush of being seen, not as just a guard, not as a uniform, not as an invisible background figure, but as a man. For so long, I had believed that my sacrifices, my struggles, my discipline went unnoticed, swallowed by the indifference of the world. Yet here, in front of dozens of witnesses, the most powerful man in the company was acknowledging them, praising them, validating them in a way I had never imagined possible. The murmurs of the crowd shifted again. I heard faint whispers. He actually praised him. Unbelievable. I thought he was finished, but the sound of their disbelief was a strange comfort, like a balm on wounds that had been festering for years. But even in that moment of relief, I couldn't fully let go of my fear. Why? Because there was something in his eyes, something unreadable, something that suggested this wasn't the end of the test. His praise was real, his words sincere, but there was an undercurrent, a sense that he wasn't finished, that he had more to say, something that would stretch this revelation into a turning point I wasn't yet ready to face. My chest rose and fell with deep, uneven breaths. Part of me wanted to collapse from the sheer emotional whiplash of the moment. Terror to relief, humiliation to pride, all in the span of minutes. Another part of me wanted to seize this moment, to cling to it as proof that everything I had endured in life had meant something. But the way he studied me, the way his eyes narrowed slightly as though measuring me still, told me that this was not just a moment of praise. It was the beginning of something bigger. And then, with deliberate slowness, he stepped even closer. His shadow loomed over me, not in menace, but in authority. His voice dropped slightly, but it carried across the courtyard with the clarity of a man used to being heard. But then he stepped even closer, and announced something that no one saw coming. Behind his wealth and power was a story that sounded painfully familiar to mine. When he stepped closer, the tension in the air shifted. The crowd expected another grand announcement, perhaps a declaration of authority or a sharp rebuke to further prove his dominance. But instead, his voice softened in a way that caught everyone off guard. There was no arrogance in it, no sharp edge of superiority. It carried the weight of memory, the heaviness of someone revisiting a past that was far removed from the polished present everyone saw before them. "I wasn't always who I am today," he said, his eyes not fixed on me alone anymore, but on the space beyond, as if he were seeing something long buried in his past. "There was a time when I stood exactly where you are now, looked down on, ignored, struggling just to survive. A time when every day felt like a battle, not for success, but for dignity." The words stunned me, and I wasn't alone. I could feel the shock ripple through the crowd. Most of them had only ever seen him as untouchable, the kind of man who had been born into success, who had power coursing through his veins since the day he first set foot in the business world. But the way he spoke carried a raw honesty that was impossible to fake. He took a slow breath, his gaze momentarily drifting to the sky before returning to me. "I grew up in poverty," he continued. "My family had nothing, not wealth, not privilege, not even security. I wore hand-me-downs until they fell apart. I worked jobs no one else wanted, cleaning, carrying, serving, anything that would put food on the table. And there were days when even that wasn't enough. Days when I went hungry so that my siblings could eat." The words pierced me like a mirror reflecting my own life back at me. I saw myself in his story. The hunger, the sacrifices, the quiet despair of being invisible to the world while fighting battles no one else could see. My chest tightened as his confession peeled back the layers of the man everyone else thought they knew, revealing something vulnerable, something real. He went on, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "When you grow up like that, you learn quickly that the world doesn't hand out respect. It doesn't hand out kindness. You have to earn everything, and often you have to do it while people laugh at you, dismiss you, or step over you as if you don't exist. That kind of life teaches you lessons you never forget. It taught me that honesty is not just a virtue, it's survival. That loyalty is not just admirable, it's essential. Because when you have nothing, the only currency you possess is your integrity." I felt every word resonate deep inside me. It was as if he was giving voice to the silent truths I had carried my whole life, but never had the power or the audience to say out loud. And for the first time, I understood why he had valued my actions at the gate. He wasn't testing me just as an employee. He was searching for something familiar, something that echoed his own journey. His eyes met mine again, sharper now, more deliberate. "You see, I never forgot where I came from. No matter how high I climbed, no matter how much money I earned, I carried those lessons with me. And I swore I would never surround myself with people who bent at the first sign of pressure, who abandoned their values just to please someone with more power. Because those people, when tested, will always fail." The crowd was silent. Not a whisper, not a shuffle of feet, not even the faint hum of conversation. It was as though his words had frozen everyone in place, forcing them to look at him not just as a CEO, but as a man who had walked a hard road to get there. For me, the moment was overwhelming. In that instant, the invisible gap between us, the chasm of wealth, power, and status, narrowed. He wasn't untouchable anymore. He wasn't just the polished figure in the expensive suit. He was human, marked by the same struggles that had shaped me. And strangely, that realization didn't just comfort me. It terrified me. Because if he had risen from the same ashes I stood in now, what excuse did I have to remain where I was? My throat tightened, and though I didn't speak, my silence carried 1,000 unspoken words: admiration, understanding, a fragile connection that I had never felt with anyone of his stature before. For years, I had believed that men like him were born into another world entirely, one that men like me could never touch. But his story shattered that illusion, and in its place, it built something far more dangerous: hope. He took a step closer, his presence now less intimidating and more commanding in a different way. His voice dropped slightly, not softer but more personal, as though he were speaking directly to me and no one else. You did what most people in your position wouldn't have done. You stood your ground. You chose your integrity over fear. And that is exactly the kind of choice I made when I was in your shoes. That's why I respect you. Respect. The word echoed inside me, foreign and unfamiliar, because it was something I had so rarely been given. To hear it from him, in front of everyone, was almost unbearable in its weight. It filled me with pride, but it also shook me to the core. And then, after a pause that felt like it lasted forever, he looked straight at me, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made the world around us blur into nothing. His next words carried the weight of a hammer about to strike, the kind of words that could alter the course of a man's life forever. And then, he looked straight at me, and made me an offer that froze me in place. In that moment, I went from a guard everyone mocked to a man everyone respected. The air shifted around me, and I could feel it, the weight of perception changing in real time. Just minutes ago, I had been the subject of laughter, whispers, and ridicule. People had seen me as a fool, a stubborn nobody picking a fight with someone far above his reach. But now, standing face to face with the CEO, hearing his words echo through the courtyard, I could sense their stares transforming. No longer mocking, no longer dismissive. They were watching me with something I had never felt from them before. Respect. The CEO held my gaze, his expression steady, unshakable, the way only someone who has carried both power and pain can look at another man. You stood your ground when everyone expected you to fold, he said, his voice strong enough to cut through the silence. That kind of courage doesn't deserve punishment. It deserves reward. The words struck me like thunder. For a second, I thought I had misheard him, that my fear-clouded mind had twisted his meaning. Reward? For standing up to him? For daring to stop him at the gate? It didn't make sense. I had prepared myself for humiliation, for dismissal, for the crushing weight of failure. Reward was not even a possibility I had considered. My lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. I was frozen, my thoughts tangled in disbelief. The crowd, too, seemed stunned into silence. The same employees who had mocked me earlier now stared wide-eyed, their whispers choked off by the magnitude of what they were hearing. I could see it in their faces. Shock, confusion, even a hint of envy. No one had expected this turn. No one had imagined that the man they had dismissed as nothing would suddenly stand in the light of praise from the most powerful figure in the company. Then came the moment that turned disbelief into something greater. The CEO stepped closer, his voice dropping just enough to feel intimate, though every ear in the courtyard caught each word. From this day forward, he said, you are no longer just a guard at this gate. You are a man I trust, a man whose integrity has proven stronger than fear, and I want you by my side. My heart stopped. My breath caught in my throat. His words crashed into me with the force of a tidal wave. By his side? What did that even mean? Promotion, responsibility, opportunity? The words swirled in my head like sparks flying in a storm. For so long, I had lived in survival mode, clinging to every paycheck as if it were my last, never daring to dream beyond the next month's bills. And now, suddenly, this man, this CEO, was offering me something more than I had ever imagined possible. I could feel the heat of dozens of eyes on me. My colleagues, my critics, the strangers who had stood by to watch me fall, they were all silent now, their disbelief painted clearly across their faces. A few shifted uncomfortably, realizing how wrong they had been. Others looked at me with envy, the kind that comes only when you see someone rise from nothing in a way you wish you could. My chest swelled with emotions I couldn't contain. Pride, relief, gratitude, disbelief all tangled together. For years, I had wondered if my sacrifices mattered, if my insistence on honesty and discipline meant anything in a world that often rewarded dishonesty and shortcuts. And here was proof that it did. Proof that all the nights I had gone hungry so others could eat, all the mornings I had stood tall in this uniform, all the humiliations I had endured, they had not been in vain. The CEO wasn't finished. He continued with deliberate care, his words steady but powerful. "Your integrity tells me more about you than any resume or interview ever could. That's the kind of man I want representing this company, the kind of man I want in positions of responsibility. You've proven yourself today in front of everyone, and I won't forget it." Gasps rippled through the crowd again. Some covered their mouths, others exchanged glances, but no one dared to speak. The atmosphere was electric, the tension of the earlier confrontation replaced now with awe and shock. I wanted to speak, to thank him, to tell him what his words meant to me, but my throat betrayed me. All I could do was nod slightly, my eyes stinging with the weight of emotions I had buried for years. This was more than a promotion. It was validation. It was the acknowledgement I had craved but never dared to expect. For so long, I had been invisible. Now, suddenly, I was seen. And yet, beneath the swelling pride, there was something else, a strange unease that I couldn't quite name. His words were powerful, his offer generous, but the way he delivered them carried a gravity that went beyond simple recognition. This wasn't just a reward. It was something larger, something I couldn't yet see. The crowd still stared, frozen in disbelief, waiting for me to respond, but I had no words to give them. All I had was the pounding of my heart, the trembling of my hands, and the knowledge that in a single moment everything had changed. But I had no idea. This offer would change not just my job, but my destiny. I didn't just gain a new position. I gained a new life. The shift was not immediate, but it was undeniable. One day, I was the man in the faded uniform standing by the gate, a figure most people ignored, a background presence whose only worth was measured by silence and invisibility. The next, I was being addressed directly by the CEO himself, invited into an office where decisions were made instead of merely enforced. My world, once confined to the narrow space of a guard post, expanded overnight into something I had never dared to dream. The first transformation came in the simplest form: money. The promotion he gave me wasn't just symbolic. It came with a salary that seemed unreal to me, numbers on a paycheck that I had only ever associated with other people's lives. Not mine. For the first time in years, I didn't have to count every dollar twice before spending it. I didn't have to choose between paying the electric bill or buying my mother's medicine. I didn't have to hide my worry behind a tired smile when my younger siblings asked for school supplies. Survival was no longer the only goal. For the first time, I could breathe. But more powerful than the money was the respect. People who once mocked me, who once laughed at my stubbornness, now looked at me differently. Their smirks were gone, replaced with something closer to awe, or perhaps guilt, as they remembered how quickly they had judged me. Where once I had been invisible, now my presence commanded acknowledgement. They greeted me with nods, sometimes even with words of admiration. The whispers that used to hum behind my back now followed me with stories of how I had stood my ground, how I had impressed the CEO, how I had turned humiliation into honor. At home, the transformation was even greater. My mother's tired eyes lit up with a joy I had not seen in years when I told her about the promotion. She held my hands and whispered prayers of gratitude, her frail voice trembling with relief. My siblings looked at me differently, too. Not just as their older brother, the man who worked himself to exhaustion for their sake, but as someone they could look up to, someone who proved that standing firm had value, that honesty and discipline could change a life. The pride in their eyes was worth more than any paycheck. In the community, word spread quickly. Neighbors who once pitied me now spoke of me with respect. Shopkeepers who barely noticed me before now greeted me warmly. Even people I had never spoken to began to nod when they saw me, as though I had somehow become a symbol of something larger than myself. For so long, I had lived in the shadows of anonymity, my life unnoticed, my struggles unseen. Now, suddenly, I was not just seen, I was remembered. And yet, the greatest transformation was not in the way others saw me, but in the way I saw myself. For years, I had carried the weight of invisibility, the quiet despair of believing that no matter how hard I worked, it would never be enough. My sense of worth had been tied so tightly to survival that I had forgotten what pride in myself felt like. But now, standing in this new position, carrying new responsibilities, I felt something awaken inside me. Confidence, dignity, the belief that I was more than just a man surviving day by day. I was a man capable of rising, of earning respect, of carrying responsibility with honor. Every morning when I put on my new uniform, one tailored, polished, carrying the weight of my new title, I felt the difference. It wasn't just clothing. It was a reminder of the journey, of the humiliations endured, of the battles fought silently, of the test I had passed when I thought I was failing. It was a symbol that my life could change, that even men like me could carve a place of dignity in a world that so often stripped it away. But even as I enjoyed this transformation, even as I cherished the relief, the pride, the new respect, there was something deeper stirring inside me. A quiet realization that what mattered most wasn't the money, wasn't the position, wasn't even the respect. It was the lesson buried beneath it all, the truth that had carried me through humiliation and fear, the truth that had turned a confrontation at the gate into the turning point of my life. Because the biggest reward wasn't what I gained, it was what I learned. Yet the biggest lesson wasn't in what I gained, but in what I learned. In the end, it wasn't the promotion or money that stayed with me. It was the truth that had carried me through humiliation, through fear, through the moment when I thought I was finished, only to discover that I was being tested for something far greater. The truth that standing firm, even when the world laughs, even when fear claws at your chest, even when you believe it will cost you everything, can turn into the very foundation of your strength. That truth was my real reward, the one that could never be taken away. When I look back at that day, I no longer see it as the morning I stopped the CEO, or the moment I became the subject of shocked whispers. I see it as the day life revealed its most painful and powerful lesson to me. That true power is not in money, or titles, or authority. True power lies in integrity, in the quiet courage to stand for what is right, even when no one stands with you. For so long, I had believed that I was invisible, that my sacrifices were unnoticed, that my life of discipline and honesty didn't matter in a world where wealth and arrogance seemed to rule. But that day shattered those lies. That day taught me that even the smallest act of courage can echo in ways you cannot imagine. My simple refusal to let one man pass without identification, a decision I thought might end my life as I knew it, became the key that unlocked a destiny I hadn't even dared to dream. And if you're listening to my story now, I want you to remember this. Your worth is not measured by the clothes you wear, the money in your account, or the recognition you receive. Your worth is measured by the choices you make when no one is watching, when the pressure is greatest, when fear whispers for you to bend. Because those are the choices that define you. Those are the choices that separate survival from dignity. I say this not as someone who has always been strong, but as someone who has felt the crushing weight of doubt, humiliation, and loneliness. I know what it feels like to be laughed at, to be mocked, to feel the world pressing against you with the force of indifference. I know how heavy it is to stand your ground when every voice tells you to step aside. And yet, I also know that the moment you choose integrity over fear, something shifts inside you. You become unbreakable, no matter the outcome. We live in a world that often rewards shortcuts, dishonesty, and bending the rules to please those in power. But I am living proof that there are still moments when integrity wins, when honesty shines brighter than arrogance, when courage is noticed even by those you least expect. The CEO didn't reward me because I was special. He rewarded me because I did what was right when it would have been easier to do what was wrong. And if I could do that, an ordinary man, a poor guard, then so can you. Money, promotions, respect, those things change your circumstances. But integrity changes your soul, and that is something no one can ever take from you. Even now, with my life transformed, with responsibilities I never imagined I could hold, I carry that lesson with me every single day. It guides me in every decision. It reminds me of who I am, and it keeps me humble, knowing that everything I gained came not from wealth or power, but from a single act of honesty at a gate where no one believed it mattered. So when you find yourself at your own gate, when life tests you in ways you don't expect, remember my story. Remember that the easy path is rarely the right one. Remember that laughter and ridicule often come before respect. And remember that sometimes the very moment you fear will destroy you becomes the moment that defines you. Because that's what happened to me. And sometimes, the truth you fear the most becomes the gift you needed all along. If this story touched your heart, don't just leave it here. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what lesson you took from it. Make sure to hit the like button if you believe integrity still matters in our world today. And if you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next life-changing moment. Your support keeps this channel alive, and together, we can keep sharing stories that remind us of the power of truth, courage, and hope.